This lesson in our series of Christian counseling courses is dealing with anger issues. The Apostle Paul tells us to deal with our anger within the time frame of a 24-hour day when he says, "Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry." This means that we must deal with it before the sun goes down. If we do not, it will begin to tempt us to sin. Ephesians 4:26 and 27. From these two verses, we can see the moral distinction between good anger and bad anger. Good anger is when you control it, and bad anger is when it controls you. I don't believe in the anger management concept of therapy that is proposed by so many counselors and psychologists in workshops and seminars today. This method usually requires you to manage anger in a way that involves venting or something similar to it. I believe the Bible teaches us to deal with anger in a responsible way. This requires expression of feelings in a loving manner, and it requires taking responsibility for those feelings. When we deal with anger issues, we must not blame others or our circumstances. Dealing with anger means that we speak the truth in love and communicate our feelings and take responsibility for our feelings and actions. It's okay to be angry. Just take responsibility for choosing to be. Paul also tells us that if we don't deal with our anger before the end of the day, the devil will have an advantage over us in our emotional state to tempt us to sin. This means that we cannot allow ourselves to be in denial or avoidance when it comes to recognizing our anger. When we are in denial or avoidance, we may feel relieved that the problem isn't before us for the moment, but it will pop up again somehow. The human psyche has a way of revealing anger issues we have been denying or avoiding in sometimes mysterious and self-destructive ways. A growing amount of evidence suggests suppressed anger does relate to hypertension and heart disease. Hypertensives who are quick to respond physiologically to stress show how high amounts of suppressed anger. Findings also confirm a link between aggressive behaviors and painful muscle tension. Studies have proven many times that anger does have a physiological effect, and that we should be aware of it. Another doctor has stated that a person cannot get sick without a stress factor being involved. Buried emotions of anger and fear are the most important stress factors in physical illness. And we must realize that anger can cause serious illness. Dr. Robert Good has stated, "Why did anger or cancer take so many and yet not take others of the same environment, such as identical twins?" He said that it is the presence of emotional stressors, particularly unresolved anger. The hormones that the body releases under prolonged stress, including the hormone adrenaline, inhibit the body's normal ability to fight and destroy cancer cells. Much of the research done on prolonged anger or stress shows that it produces many health risks and can ultimately produce premature death. We must learn to express anger in a biblical way so that we can maintain better physical and emotional health. Anger is a defense mechanism. When I first heard this story a few years ago, I couldn't believe it, but I am told that the following is a true story. A couple in Switzerland began to fight in a way that brought a battle of mayhem. It all began when the husband canceled one vacation trip too many for his wife. She expressed her disappointment by pouring bicarbonate of soda into the fish tank, wiping out his rare tropical fish. A long argument followed. Then he grabbed a selection of his wife's diamond jewelry and threw it into the garbage disposal. She responded by flinging all his stereo equipment into a swimming pool. He then doused her $200,000 wardrobe, fur coats, designer gowns and all, with liquid bleach. Then things began to go downhill. She poured a gallon of paint all over his $70,000 Ferrari, so he kicked a hole in a $180,000 Picasso original she loved. She had just opened then the seacocks of the 38-foot yacht causing it to sink at its dock. When the couple's daughter came home and saw what had been going on, she called the police. They were powerless to do anything. It was not legal for the couple to destroy their own property. Eventually, the family lawyer managed to arrange a truce. As ironic and silly as this story may seem, many people in homes where vengeful emotions are out of hand and anger rules the day, and people lose control of their senses. I have listed in my book, The Power of Biblical Thinking, 10 irrational beliefs that produce anger. Number 1, I must be loved by every person I believe to be significant and important. Number 2, I must control attitudes and affections of others. Number 3, I must have a high degree of order and certainty to be happy. Number 4, I must be competent and successful in all things I attempt. Number 5, I must be treated well by other people or I will be emotionally disturbed. Number 6, I must have no bad experiences in my past or the past will continually ruin my future and never really be overcome. Number 7, I must have a life that is entirely pleasant, without any frustration. Number 8, I must make everybody happy and content. Number 9, I believe unhappiness is caused by my circumstances. Number 10, I must have all my needs met. These lies create perceived threats in us and angry emotions that can cause us to engage in self-destructive behavior. The following options that are here to help us deal with anger. These options for dealing with anger are, number 1, confirm the anger. Evaluate whether or not it is worth responding to. Some situations are not worth responding to. So confirm whether or not it is worthy of a response. Or, response number 2, postpone it. To postpone it means we evaluate how, when, and where to express it. It is actually dealing with it, but waiting for a later time. Number 3 in this list is express it. Expressing it in iMessages, not venting. The unique thing about iMessages is that they require that we be non-accusative in our speech and willing to describe our feelings and willing to take responsibility for our feelings. An example of someone using an accusative message would be, "You don't love me because you didn't." Or an example of an accusative iMessage would be, "I felt hurt and angry when you didn't such and such." Speaking the truth in love is what we need to do, Ephesians 4:15. When we choose to postpone for a day or two, we are really dealing with our anger. If we have a plan to deal with it and we execute it. iMessages reduce defensive responses. Anger is a defense mechanism. It is a natural response of the mind and body when threatened. God has given our bodies the hormone adrenaline to prepare for physical threats. He has also built into our emotional makeup the ability to get angry as a way of preparing our minds against a psychological threat. Anger is a natural response for the defense and preservation of important belief systems and physical health. It is a response with the intent of preserving our worth, our basic needs, and our convictions. When our self-esteem is threatened, we tend to be defensive and angry. When our essential needs, such as emotional needs and physical needs, are threatened, we get angry and develop a defensive posture. And when we feel that our basic convictions on vital subjects are under attack, we become defensive. In my counseling practice, I have observed the following progressive steps in the lives of troubled people. I call these 5 steps to an emotional crisis. First of all, there's perceived threats. Threats that are either real or imaginary. From there, the next step is fear and anxiety. These immediately follow. From there, then, we have anger and anxiety. And when anger is unchecked, it turns to bitterness. The next step, then, is hopelessness. Hopelessness follows the failure to resolve the anger issues. And then the final step is depression, which can lead to clinical depression. Psychologically, the above steps will be experienced sequentially, even if not consciously, but they can be controlled. Again, the Bible says that we must deal with our anger before the day ends. Once we have realized our anger, it should be a red flag for us to recognize that there is a perceived threat that we must deal with. It should alert us to a threat that is either real or imaginary. A real threat is recognized by the immediate potential harm we perceive in our presence. An imaginary threat is one in which we perceive a threat to our being, but there is no immediate danger. It could be imaginary in the sense of a supposed attack on our self-worth or on our basic belief systems, even though there seems to be no immediate danger. I am convinced that all anger responses are responses to perceived threats. In other words, every time we feel angry, there is a perceived threat in our belief systems. If it is real, then we need to deal with it as best we can. If it is not, then we must examine our thoughts and make sure that we are telling ourselves the truth. Anger can become a programmed response, a defense mechanism that is programmed into our mind to a perceived threat. I also believe that the dysfunctional family is a model of angry responses to perceived threats. It is a model we can look at of false belief systems and how they create in the family system a survival mentality that adversely affects the whole family. It affects their interpersonal relationships and creates an inability on the part of the family members to communicate their feelings and to develop problem-solving skills. Anger and fear are emotions that rule the hearts of dysfunctional family members every day. The primary criteria that qualifies a family as dysfunctional is a lack of personal identity of individual members, a lack of communication skills, and a lack of problem-solving skills to deal with everyday problems that arise in interpersonal relationships. The dysfunctional family is really a model of systems. The systems model in family therapy assumes that the nuclear family is the basic context in which problems occur. The family is seen as a rule-governed organism that has a dynamic which transcends that of its separate participants. If it is our intention to really understand a particular individual, it is argued, then we must become thoroughly familiar with his or her family system. A system can be defined as a group of interconnected or interrelated parts which mutually interact across time. Systems have distinct characteristics and are made up of their parts and the relationships of their parts, and thus the system is greater than the sum of its individual parts. Systems are characterized by an interdependency, which includes how the parts influence each other. There are no insignificant parts. Systems have boundaries that differentiate one system from another system. A system is an organism. A particular member's dysfunctional behavior under the systems theory reflects a family system that is dysfunctional. The troubled member reveals a family in trouble. If a family is dysfunctional, the family relationships that support the lack of stability must be dealt with, or long-term change in the troubled family is unlikely. Since the dysfunctional family is a closed system, it makes sense to explore how each family member affects and influences the other. Originally, the word codependence was limited to the study of alcoholic families. It was first used to label the spouse of the alcoholic. Later, as family systems thinking came to be used, the whole family was seen as codependent. Codependency is the most common symptom of a dysfunctional family. In every dysfunctional family, there is a primary stressor, and each family member adapts to this stress in an attempt to control and appease the stressor. Each family then becomes involved in adapting to the stressor as long as the stress exists. Each becomes codependent on the stressor. This state of readiness was intended by nature to be a survival state. In dysfunctional families, it is often the normal state. When a threat actually occurs, the person responds with survival behaviors. Such behaviors include denial, dissociation, repression, or withdrawal, and anger. Survival behaviors are actual responses to the violent and sometimes passive manipulations and threatening behavior of the primary stressor. The adult child of a dysfunctional family learns to survive by developing certain patterns of behavior. As the child of a dysfunctional family grows up, these survival behaviors continue even though they are now disconnected from the original stressor. These survival behaviors feel normal since they are the patterns one used every day of his or her early life in order to survive. As an adult, survival behaviors are unnecessary and can be very unhealthy. While they were once protective, now they are destructive. There must be a change in the belief systems for the member to change his or her behavior. Survival behaviors are hard to give up. They have become very familiar. They help the person survive by developing a kind of power that resulted from sacrificing self. In every case, the person threatened develops a dependency on things outside himself to the point of self-neglect. In counseling cases I have been involved with, there has always been an underlying sense of anger and bitterness. I believe that anger is a defense mechanism for the dysfunctional member who possesses a victim mentality in most situations in life. He or she is always lacking in fulfilling their essential needs, and they do not become self-actualized. A dysfunctional family member believes that his identity lies outside himself in a substance, activity, or another person. He has sold himself, and he is not able to be his own person. The person then develops a survival belief system which produces the following programmed responses: people-pleasing, self-debasing, antisocial behavior, denial, distrust of others, intimidating and controlling, blaming, avenging, habitual lying, manipulation, unhealthy expression of anger, avoidance or rejection of feelings, lack of relational and problem-solving skills. Codependent or enabling children have given up their own identity in order to take care of their parents or the needs of the family system. The codependent must live a life of survival, like animals, always on guard against threats from the outside. Thus, the continuing underlying emotion of anger is always under the surface, ready to explode. Many times, codependents try to make themselves indispensable by taking care of others. They are willing to do whatever it takes to be loved or feel significance. Once a person believes that his identity lies outside himself, in a substance, activity, or another person, he has sold himself and he is not able to fulfill his own essential needs. He or she is not able to truly love and be loved as long as he or she believes that they are not worthy of love and must always be on the alert to please others. God created in us basic needs. We need to be loved, respected, needed, capable, significant, and secure in our self-worth. Neglecting such essential needs to serve others, especially the primary stressor in the family, is not healthy spiritually, emotionally, or psychologically. God wants us to serve others and put their needs first, but not at the expense of our self-worth or as a response to a threat. Our service to others should be an act of the will. In their very popular book, Boundaries, Drs. Cloud and Townsend state that the purpose of boundaries is not to put limits on others, but to put limits on ourselves and our exposure to others who may be using or manipulating us. In other words, boundaries are limits on how we allow others to influence us and are vital to our own emotional, psychological, and spiritual health. This problem usually is seen in the context of the controller versus the compliant person. When the controller seeks to control others by manipulation or intimidation, it is sinful and harmful to a relationship. The Bible tells us that we must be responsible for our feelings and our actions. In the Galatian letter, Paul says that we should carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. In another verse, Paul says, for each one should carry his own load. Galatians 6:2 and 5. These two verses seem contradictory at first glance until you examine the Greek words and their definitions. The Greek word for burden in verse 2 is baros, meaning a weight or anything pressing on one physically. It could be equated to a giant boulder that is too much for the one man to carry. The Greek word for load in verse 5 is portion. Vine says the difference between portion and baros is that portion is simply something to be borne without reference to its weight, but baros always suggests what is heavy or burdensome. It could be said that baros represents a boulder of immense weight, and portion or fortune represents something as light as a backpack for hiking. What God is really telling us through the Apostle Paul is that we are to help those who can't carry the load because it is too much for them. But we should take responsibility for our own burdens that we are capable of carrying. If we are not willing to take our own responsibilities when we are capable, we are sinning before God. And I believe that we should be able to take the loads that we're capable of carrying. When we are enabling others, or when we enable others by carrying their load, when they are capable, we are enabling them to be irresponsible and are therefore sinning, I believe, against the will of God. I believe the above statements with all my heart, and I believe that we must be strong at set limits on others in regards to their influence on us when they use us to fulfill their responsibilities. When we allow them to be irresponsible, we encourage their lack of commitment to God and their slothfulness in life. This is the biggest problem with dysfunctional families. They allow others to control them. They allow others to manipulate them. They allow others in their life to dictate their worth. And in the dysfunctional family, there's not the allowance of free expression. In the dysfunctional family, there's not the allowance of a person being themselves and being able to experience what it's like to know who they are and what their future is like. There is the constant pressure to appease somebody else. And in that constant pressure, there is the fear of being threatened. And that is something that's inherent in us. God has given us the desire to seek to know who we are and to develop a self-worth. And when we're denied that, for whatever reason, we feel a threat to us, to our personal being. And in that perceived threat, anger always is involved, because anger is always a defense mechanism to a perceived threat. God has shown us how to deal with anger, I believe, through the Apostle Paul. He has told us we have the ability to deal with anger if we have the mindset to realize that we can control anger, to realize that when we are angry, we should not blame others or we should not blame the weather or whatever, but that we should take responsibility for that anger. And in taking responsibility for the anger, then we begin to realize we do have control. When I take responsibility for the times that I'm angry, it helps me to understand that if I take responsibility, then I can control that anger. And in controlling it, I learn how to deal with it. And in dealing with it, I learn that God gives me the power and the strength to be able to control my emotions in life. When the Apostle Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, I can do all things through Christ, in that context, he was bringing out the point that whether he was wealthy or poor, no matter what circumstance he might find himself in, no matter how difficult that circumstance, how trying, how painful, he could realize that within himself and with the power of God and with his trust in God, that he could overcome all things, that he can control his life, that he can control his emotions, and that anger, even though it will come, it will arise, is something that can be controlled with the power of God. And sometimes it's necessary and useful as we deal with other people. But at all times, it's something that needs to be under control and to realize we are responsible when we're angry. It's difficult for us to accept the fact that when we are angry, we can't blame anybody else but ourselves, that it is a choice. But once we come to the conclusion of understanding and believing and accepting the fact that it is a choice, we have come to the point where we've allowed God to help us and we've taken control of our lives and our anger. Thank you.